Nearly 500 years ago, the returning Spanish conquistadors brought back a number of marvelous treasures to Europe from the New World. Things like gold and silver, of course, we always think of those, but so many other things that were marvelous, like chocolate and sunflowers and tomatoes, huge numbers of things that have really changed the way that our lives are lived today. There was one particular thing that they brought back that completely changed the face of Europe. And it is credited, that one thing, with approximately 1/4 of the population growth in Europe from the 1700s on, and in a very short period of time of about 3 years, approximately 1 million deaths. And I'm wondering if you know what that thing might be. If you don't, that would be the potato. So there's a lot of interesting things about the potato that you may not know. First of all, you can grow it almost anywhere. It's very non-fussy in terms of growing situation. You can feed it to livestock as well as to people, which you can see could generate a lot of ability to have bigger families and more kids who live to adulthood. And it packs a lot of calories and it tastes good. But the really interesting thing about the potato is that you can live your whole life post, once you start eating regular food, you can live your whole life in a relatively healthy way on all the nutrients and amino acids contained in potatoes plus milk. So if you have milk and potatoes, you can live a healthy life. And imagine, if you will, eating nothing but potatoes and milk for your whole life and what that might be like. And then you would probably say, well, I kind of like potatoes, but potatoes and milk for breakfast, cheese and baked potatoes for lunch, more scalloped potatoes for dinner, potatoes. And after a while, you have to admit it would get pretty boring. And you'd ask, why would anybody ever do that? Well, in reality, they probably wouldn't by choice. But in the early 1800s, the Irish did pretty much that for a variety of economic and sociological reasons. And when the potato famine hit in the 1830s, they had two choices, because all the potatoes in Europe were wiped out in that famine line. They could either do what my family did and move somewhere else, move to the New World and New England in my family's case, or they starved. And approximately 1 million people starved in a 3-year period because of that. Now, I know you're sitting there and you're wondering to yourself, while this is a very interesting lecture on the dangers of monocropping, why is this woman talking about potatoes? Great question. The reason for that is because I believe that's exactly what many leaders have done when it comes to being inspirational. We have endless conference calls. We have Zoom calls that make us all crazy and exhausted by the end of the day. And where half the people, the only way they can stay awake is by doing something else while the call is going on, even if it's their own Zoom call or their own conference call. And then even before this era, we had meetings that went on much longer than they needed to, and the effort to stay awake in those meetings was terrible. When it's come to being truly inspirational and motivational, our leaders have served us, and we as leaders have served our people, a boring diet that is about as interesting as potatoes and milk. So I'm going to ask you to think about pushing the potatoes a little bit over to the side of the plate where they belong, and think about some new ways to energize, motivate, influence, and connect with the people around you so that you can be the leader that you want to be. So I'm going to talk to you today about storytelling. And storytelling really has 3 parts that can be taught, and we're only going to talk about one of them today. The first thing is, what makes storytelling work? Why do stories work, both in the brain and conceptually? So the basic elements, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. Another time, perhaps we can come back and talk about the narrative structure and also how to deliver stories from the body language and vocal standpoint. So we today are going to talk about what makes storytelling work and the basic elements and what does that mean. And I have for you 3 goals. The first is I want to expand your idea of what you think a story is. Second, I want a lot of the things I'm going to tell you, you will say, I know that, but I'll bet you have not been doing them, and you certainly haven't been doing them deliberately and on purpose. So, my second goal is to make you think about being more purposeful in the way that you approach data that you're trying to present or stories that you're trying to present. And the third thing, which is my number one goal, is to help you find more ways to own your best true full self in the world and to show up fully as who you are. So, because that's motivational to everyone. So, part one of this is going to be why stories are important. And the second that we'll talk about as we go forward is what kinds of techniques can you actually put into play immediately, even without a narrative form of a story? What can you do now to make things more connected and inspirational for the people around you? So, we're going to think about your ancestors. Think about the people who sat around the fires and before writing and who told stories. We are, as humans, we have for eons and eons and eons learned our important lessons through storytelling, whether it's sitting around the campfire and talking about their experiences, whether it's fables, epic myths, legends, Bible stories, Facebook, stories that your grandmother told you. All of those things are human ways to show how experiences come through. Sometimes people say to me, don't you think, Cindy, that storytelling is kind of a fluffy thing? And I say, no, not at all. That's just the name. Storytelling is experience, either our own experience or someone else's experience, as a source of understanding or a justification for belief. So stories are our experience as a source of understanding or justification for belief. I'm quoting myself, as I often like to do. So humans have been telling stories forever because they work. I want you to think about, and they work to influence, they work to inspire, they work to connect, and they work to teach. I want you to think about if you've ever had a really, really, really good salesperson. And if you think about that salesperson, how did they make you feel? And the likelihood is they didn't make you feel like you were being sold. They made you feel like they gave you something that inspired you to buy. They connected with you in such a way that was personal, that tied into what you cared about and what you believed. I like to think of inspiration as being the act of giving or receiving a vision of a transformed future. A salesperson transforms your future by selling you something. We transform our people's future by having them see a vision of a different one. So as far as giving or receiving a vision, it's also buying or selling a vision. And so the same things that work to inspire people work to influence them and persuade them. So these are just two halves of the same kind of a coin to think about. There was a study that was done a few years back, and if you know me, you know I love studies. And there was a group of people, I think it was at the University of Michigan, who were looking at the effect of political scandal on what people remember about the candidates. And they took college students, as they often do in these psychological kinds of studies, and they looked at, half of them were given newspaper articles about a fictitious Senate race with the positions of the people who were running and the background on their families and all the regular kinds of things that you get about candidates. The second group of 242 people was given the same stories, basically, but two of them, which were repetitive, were replaced. And they were replaced with stories about a scandalous affair that one of the one of the candidates had supposedly had with a junior aide, which of course never happens in real life. So they told them to read these things, and then they went back 2 weeks later and tested them to see what they remembered. Now, when I heard this, I thought, as many of you might think, I thought they would remember the scandal, that it would overshadow everything else and they wouldn't remember anything else that was happening. And that, in fact, was their working hypothesis. But what they found was something very different. They found that the people who had gotten the interesting story remembered everything better. And their conjecture was that stories that have an emotional component or an interesting component, like an affair that somebody might have outside of marriage, create a node of a sort in the emotional centers of the brain to which other things and other memories more easily stick. They're a center for that, for holding on to information. So learning to tell stories that have that kind of a emotional hook to them can mean that your information will therefore become more memorable, which is actually pretty cool. So the way to become memorable is to use some of the things that come from storytelling in order to make people hook into that information. And to speak a little bit about the brain, and a lot of you have seen this before, I like to think of this as like a model of the brain, that you have the spinal cord and then the brain stem, then the limbic system, which I know is not really a system, but is conglomerations of organs that drive the emotional centers of the brain. And then over the top of that is the cerebral cortex. So we have the brain stem, which is the basic functions, the automatic functions, digestion, breathing, all of those sorts of things. Then we have the limbic system, which is, again, the emotional centers of the brain, driven mostly by the amygdala, which is hormone central and puts out hormones. And then we have the cerebral cortex, which are the executive and higher functions. All of the lower, called it this is the mammalian brain, and all of the lower parts of the brain, the limbic system and the brain stem, are preconscious. They can process thousands of things at a time, whereas the cerebral cortex can only process about 7 at a time, roughly. But there's something even more interesting about the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. That is that the process that for information to get to the limbic brainstem and limbic system is almost instantaneous, whether it comes to the spinal cord or whether it comes through the optic nerves or the auditory nerves. It's the reactive part of the brain, and it is almost instantaneous. The limbic system then has a first reaction and then sends the information up to the cerebral cortices, to the executive function, and there's a gap in time. And that gap is about between 2 and 3 seconds. So that is, if you imagine that you are about to step off the curb in a city somewhere, and all of a sudden something comes around the corner and your body instantly jumps back, and then you say, Uber car. The distance in time between your reactive mind and your thinking mind is the distance in time between your jumping back and your naming it with the cognitive language centers of the brain. Now, why is this important for storytelling? Very interesting. We are hardwired to feel first, think later, react first, analyze later. All decisions, that would be all decisions, 100% of every decision you ever make in your life is made first in the limbic system. Yes, it can be overruled by the executive functions of the brain, but it is made first in the limbic system. In fact, all reactions happen first in the limbic system, all decisions, and all memories are, if not emotional, they are emotionally coded. All reactions, decisions, and memories are emotionally coded. So in order to get the decisions that you want out of people, you have to engage the emotional centers of the brain. Facts drive thinking, absolutely, and the executive functions can overrule, but stories create a sense of feeling. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to give you the beginning, and the first you're going to say, who cares? The farmer the farmer's wife died, and then the farmer died. And you say, oh, so the farmer's wife died, and then the farmer died of a broken heart. And if you're like most of us, you go, oh, and you feel that tug of emotion. And that tug of emotion is your limbic system coding that idea with an emotional response, which makes it more memorable. A six-word story written by Ernest Hemingway began with baby shoes for sale. Baby shoes for sale. So what? Baby shoes for sale, never worn. So those kinds of coding, and you all go, oh no, those kinds of coding can cause people to remember what you say, remember the story, and then the facts that connect with it. It can even be in the business world where you say, my team had a 15% increase in their sales. So what? We don't know what it means. My team had a 15% interest in their sales. It made me so proud. I've never been prouder of anything in my life. That puts it in a whole different context for you and gives you more information as well. But the emotional content is the thing that carries it. Facts of thinking, stories induce feeling, and feeling creates connection, memory, influence, and inspiration. There's a nice quote that came from an article on consciousness. Excuse me. Arguments really rarely shift intuitions, and we've certainly seen that in this election cycle. It's through stories that we revise our sense of what's natural. Stories are intuition pumps. So it's stories that inspire people to change. So how do we do that? So I'm going to give you some techniques for storytelling and some ways of thinking about storytelling that make data feel like a story. So it's not so cold, so it's not so dry, but it connects with the parts of the brain that create learning and memory. So the first thing to think about is your own story. You want to be able, you folks are doing a lot of networking, you do network over Zoom or whatever platform you're using. We'll go back presumably to networking in the real world after hopefully we have a post-COVID. You want to not only when you network be interesting, but give the people that you're talking to something interesting to talk about. So here, what I see a lot of times is when you go to meet people or you go to meet a boss for the first time, it's blah, blah, blah. They say, so tell me about yourself. And people go on and on and on and on. And there's nothing that catches for the listener to help respond to that. So I suggest thinking about how you can describe yourself in a way that's different. Here's me. Well, let's see. I'm a Wall Street dropout, a semi-professional singer, a brain hobbyist, and a person who loves her work way too much to retire quite yet, even though I'm old. Believe it or not, all this connects to what I do now, which is coaching and teaching people to get out of their own way and become more confident leaders who are living their best true self. Which is way more interesting, I think, than some of the other ways that I could introduce myself with merely listing off my credentials. So an exercise for all of you to think about doing is think about what makes you unique in the world. And every one of you, there never has been, there never will be another you in the history of the universe. So start thinking about how you're going to tell your own story. And different things are going to be relevant to different times and different speaking situations and different audiences. What's something that's interesting about you? What's something that's different about you than other people? What is the one thing you do better than most other people do? Then also, if you're talking about your work, what in your work do you find exciting? What is one thing you love or love doing? The cautionary note I make on this all the time for all of you is, personally, I believe the word passion has been overused, and I also believe that passion is a very high bar. A lot of us struggle to think, have I found my passion? Do I know what my passion is? And so if I were to ask you to say, what are you passionate about? I would say probably only about 20% of you would be able to come up with something that really made sense. And so I ask instead, what do you find interesting? What do you find exciting? What do you love? What do you think is fun? Also, what makes you curious? Because I believe if you follow your curiosity, that will lead you to your passion. And then you will be able to say, my passion is helping other people get out of their own way. My passion is helping people to live happier lives, so that you look into how you might tie together what you have to say about yourself with something really meaningful, which is part of your story, is what drives your meaning is the thing that makes you powerful. I also like to think in terms of presenting yourself to your higher outcome, to your higher vision, to your higher goal. And I don't necessarily mean that from a religious standpoint, although there are persons for whom that is relevant and appropriate. I'm thinking of, if you do your job right in the world, what happens? That's good. And here are some examples. If I do my job right, sailors come home safe. That was from a defense person in the defense industry that I was working with. Sailors, if I do my job right, sailors come home safe. You can see how that could drive someone. You can see how that gives a sense of story to that person's life as well. If I do my job right, people get peace of mind. The next one is from actually a biotech company. This is their mission. If we do our job right, no one's life will be restricted by genetic disease. Those are kind of the higher purposes that we can bring to our life that can drive a sense of story in what we're doing. In my case, if I do my job right, people I work with live happier lives. And that to me is more compelling when you're presenting your own story to other people than merely, I got an MBA from UCLA and I worked in consumer packaged goods sales. So and then I went to Wall Street and I dropped out, et cetera. So think in terms of, how do you present your story in a way that's meaningful? And it doesn't have to be that whole narrative of a story from start to finish. It can be the details that you put in that add to the interesting part of who you are. I had a year ago, March, I had a client, called Tony. She was a senior leader at a mid-sized defense contractor. She was looking to move up. She was ambitious and she cared, and she was a person who wanted sailors to come home safe. Really interesting person, former naval officer, brilliant, focused, super funny, and really great with her people. I think all of you would have liked her. So we were sitting there and we were looking at her 360 results, which I had accumulated and put into a report to bring back to her about what the next level up was saying about her, which was the equivalent of a kind of a C-suite. Excuse me. And she got angry and she said, what do they mean? They think I'm not strategic. I'm not a big picture person. Which, by the way, is unfortunately something I hear often about women, that they're not strategic, they don't have a strategic vision, or they don't have a big picture. And I think of that in terms of they're not telling a larger story, and that's what was her case. This was a consistent message from several of the people at that C-suite level. Now, that doesn't make it true, mind you, because a lot of times reputations are built by several people talking in their own bubble and exchanging informations and then coming to believe their own stories. But in this case, it was clearly holding her back, especially because the people who were giving that feedback were people who would be making decisions about her ability to move ahead. Fortunately, they seem to be supportive of coaching, though one guy did ask me in the 360s, can you really coach people to be strategic? And I thought, I don't know whether I can or not. But in her case, I could, because the problem wasn't that she wasn't strategic. The problem was, and this is crazy, she was one of the most strategic people I've ever met. She was very forward looking, very thoughtful about the future. She had a vision for her work. She had a vision for her company, and she had a vision for her own life, which was truly amazing. I mean, seriously, how many people do you really know that have a 5-year plan for their career? They might say, I think I would know where I want to be in 5 years, but most people don't have a plan. Most people don't work to that. I was, in fact, totally in awe of her. But the guys at the top, and they were all guys, excuse me, a piece of paper just dropped onto the floor. They were all guys. They couldn't hear her. They couldn't hear her strategic message. Some of it was her general communication style, because she had a very flat affect in her voice, which is typical of a lot of military style presenting, as opposed to corporate style presenting. But the other thing is, she didn't do the things she needed to do to make the data feel like a story, to catch the attention and hook those people into her message in a way that was meaningful. Now, the other thing I'm going to tell you ahead of time, and hopefully you'll catch me not doing this, when you tell these kinds of stories, whether they are about yourself or about other people, you have to avoid what I call resume language. And there's buzzwords that come in from time to time. Right now, pivot is the big buzzword that we're hearing a lot of. But here's my example of resume language. Single-handedly managed the successful upgrade and deployment of new 25-time more efficient environmental illumination system throughout the entire facility with 0 cost overruns and 0 safety incidents. That's resume language to me. I see a lot of that kind of thing, and I hear that kind of thing from people in their stories. The emotional centers of the brain are about as smart as a stupid 4-year-old. You have to use words that are more likely to be understood by a stupid 4-year-old than by a highly intellectual corporate executive if you want to hook into those centers. What that said was, I replaced all the old light bulbs in my house with on-sale LED lights, and I didn't fall off the step stool. That is a much more meaningful story than putting it into resume language. So with one of my tips within this is avoid resume language. Use 1, 2, maybe 3-syllable words that are really understandable and really clear in order to make your stories come alive, because that's the way we talk. And that's the way your ancestors around the fire talked. So you're going to want to tell stories about real people and what they did, including yourself. Tell stories about real experiences and how they felt. I told you I was in awe of this woman. I told you she was amazing. I told you that you would have liked her. I did all of those things deliberately so you would feel an emotional connection with the story. And finally, tell stories in everyday language. Now, I know some of you out there are saying, but Cindy, we can't tell stories all the time when our clients are interested in getting the information about data and facts. And yes, you are correct. And you can make the data and facts more meaningful by changing the way you approach and thinking of it from a storytelling mindset. So I am going to talk to you about ways to make the data feel more like a story so it doesn't come across. And I quote my other favorite person I like to quote, which is any random client or employee. If you're not excited about your work, why should I be? With the caveat that you don't want people thinking about leaving before your message has come across. Now, I don't know whether this will apply to everyone who's listening to me right now, but there is something that you may remember from being a kid called a pinky swear or a pinky promise. And interestingly enough, similar types of things exist in many, many countries around the world, including Japan and Ethiopia and a number of different places. When I was a little girl, if you wanted to swear a promise that you were actually going to do something and make it be important, you would hook together your little fingers with your friend and you would chant, or we would chant, make a friend, never ever break a friend. And that physical contact and that simple emotional chant caused you theoretically to remember and take the promise and the swear more seriously. It's used in a couple of different ways elsewhere in the world. I was told some places it's, yeah, there's a, if you say things at the same time, sometimes they do the pinky swear. There are a variety of ways to do it, but that is the kind of, I want you to think about hooking in to the emotional importance of what you're saying with a variety of techniques. When I talk about emotion also, I want you to think there is something called the illusion of transparency. And the illusion of transparency is a tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which their personal mental state is known by others. How this manifests itself mostly is when people are giving a speech and they're really, really nervous and they think everyone can see it. The good news is most of the time people can't. And you're just getting a number of different pieces of information that you're giving to yourself, like you're talking to a box on top of your head. The bad news is this also is true for how you give messages. People do not use their expressiveness of their voice fully, and they do not use words and emotional cues to let other people know how they feel about things, and other people therefore don't understand importance, they don't understand value, and they don't understand what they're supposed to feel about things. So I am going to give you words to connect, influence, and inspire that are importance cues, value cues, and what I call directed feeling cues to make your data feel much more like a story than it would otherwise do. We talked about the limbic system, importance, value, and feeling all are in the limbic system. If you have portions of the limbic system of your brain destroyed, you cannot make a decision because you cannot evaluate importance, because right and wrong is a value judgment that is driven by emotion. The people who have that part of their brain destroyed go through an endless pro and con, pro and con, pro and con, but there's never the feeling of something being right that allows them to actually make a decision. So how do you make other people understand that things are important, have value, and they connect with a gut feeling of rightness? So the first of my emotion hooks are importance cues. And that is deliberately putting in words for significance, priority, and key points to pay attention to. This is what tells people to stop and listen, are these importance cues. It would be as if I said, this is the most important thing I'm going to say to you today. That tells you, oh, you better listen, because most people's brains are distracted and kind of lazy, and they don't want to use up extra energy, so they don't pay attention if they don't have to. But if you clearly state that this is important and this is what you should do, then you greatly increase the likelihood that people will understand. Here's some examples, some general ones. This is critical, this is important, this is key, this is vital. Strategic words. I'm going to talk to you about our strategic master plan. I want to talk to you about what I think should happen 5 years out in the big picture. There are opportunities, completely new, no precedent, only chance, time, looming, imminent, urgent, immediate. There are lots and lots of other kinds of importance cues. They are the adjectives and adverbs that cause people to go, oh, I have to pay attention now and hear what you have to say after that. So here, if I go back to my military officer who was worried about the strategy, I'm here to talk to you about the future implications of our plan. That would be the kind of thing that she would say to her senior management. Oh, yawn. They didn't hear her. So we started putting in importance cues. First, we yawned. I'm here to talk to you about the critical long-term strategic implications of our current plan over the next 5 years. So all of a sudden, she has gone from talking about this vague future to a very specific plan-oriented 5-year out plan so that these people can now say, oh, she's talking about strategy. And by the way, I believe that talking about using these kinds of words, especially in the strategic world, causes your own brain to then kick in and start investigating what are more strategic kinds of things that you could think about. So using the words to other people to talk about strategy, I believe, makes you not only sound more strategic, but makes you become more strategic. The second kind of hook are value cues. And that's hooking to what someone cares about. And you can care about a whole lot of things. Here's some example: power, relationships, expertise, profit, approval, family status, et cetera, et cetera. Strategic vision being at the end of that. And if you get in the habit of thinking about this, you get in the habit of noticing what people care about. And then what you do is put in the language that puts it into their story as opposed to your story. You might care about meaning, impact, and independence. But if you talk to them about that, they're not going to hear you. But if you talk to them about things from their story, power, relationship, strategic vision, they'll hear you. So here is if, for example, her person cared about winning. I'm here today to talk to you about the critical long-term strategic implications of our current plan over the next 5 years. That, I believe, will affect our ability to beat the competition. So she puts it into their story in the words of their story. Now, what if they cared about something else? What if they cared about relationships, for example? Then the story is the same, but the hook to their story changes. I'm here to talk to you about the critical long-term strategic implications of our current plan over the next 5 years that I believe will affect team morale and our culture. So hooking back into what they consider to be important. And the final kind of emotional cue are what I call directed feeling cues. And that is explicit emotional statements that tell someone what to feel. So basically you're giving people signposts and all of these things. Importance is signposts. Importance cues are signposts to what is important. Value cues are signposts to what have value, and directed feeling cues are signposts to what someone should feel about what's going on. Here's some examples. But here's what's really interesting. I'm very concerned about this. I think you'll find this compelling. The results were surprising. It broke my heart when I heard about this. I think you'll be pleased. Or, as I said about this particular woman, I think you would have liked her. I'm telling you what to feel. I'm putting you in this story with the same feelings that I'm experiencing. So here we are with my example. I'm here today to talk to you about the critical long-term strategic implications of our current plan. I'm very concerned. Over the next 5 years, I believe plans will affect our ability to beat the competition. So you see how thinking in terms of what is my story that I want to tell, but how do I then translate it in so that I hook into the story of the person that I'm talking to? All of these things can begin to generate a much more memorable, inspiring, and connected outlook. And the bonus outcome, as far as I'm concerned, is connecting consciously and deliberately to your own emotions helps you own and be true to who you really are at your best, deepest, and most authentic self. And allowing that truth to come forward also becomes the inspiring factor for other people. Now, there's some of you out there who probably want to know what happened to my naval officer. She did all those things that we talked about. She became, frankly, even more strategic than she was at that time. And she not only drove her vision across the company, but was seen by the people who worked with her in a subsequent 360 to be one of the most inspirational leaders that they had ever had. And she is now running that particular division. And I am so happy for her that her strategic vision came forward and became the truth of the organization that she was working for. So this was the basics of what makes storytelling work and the basic elements. And again, I hope that I've been able to expand your idea of what a story is a little bit, help you be more purposeful and thoughtful about how you approach your language and all the pieces that are involved in what you're doing. And with luck, help you own your best, true, full self. Because frankly, my higher mission, when I get to the end of my life, I want to be able to say, I don't have kids, so I don't have the legacy there, but I want to be able to say that some people have happier, more successful lives because of some of the things I brought with that. Thank you very much. May you all live happily ever after. And no more potatoes and milk.